Hey there, YouTube. I'm Latter-day Skeptic. If you like the content I'm putting out here, please like and subscribe and share it with your friends. It really helps out the channel. Hey there, YouTube. I'm Latter-day Skeptic, here with another guest. I've got Troy Leavitt with me. And if you've been around I feel like I might be coining this term right at this moment, but the alternative exmo space, then you've definitely seen Troy or seen some of Troy's comments. So welcome, Troy.
Hey, thanks. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to finally get to talk to you in person instead of just in the comments.
I know I keep having this reoccurring problem happen where I interact with people on the comments and it starts to become like, oh yeah, we know each other. And then
Yeah,
you realize like we've never actually spoken. It's probably a better idea to actually get on the microphone and get on, like video chat and have a real conversation.
yeah. I've really kind of glommed onto your channel because I think we see the world somewhat similarly. You're kind of in that. It seems to me anyway. You're in a bit of that scientifically minded kind of skeptical new atheist position, but you're kind of resistant to that very, or it looks to me, that left leaning kind of woke demographic that's formed around most of the ex-Mormon community. And so we're kind of, like you said, we're this almost this out group on the outside of the ex-Mormons because we're out here kind of doing our classical liberal approach to things and don't really feel like we always fit in with those guys, or that's how it appears to me.
No, that's exactly what it feels like. And that was one of the reasons I started my channel is I was like, there doesn't seem to be a lot of, and keep in mind, it was because the algorithm was feeding me the most popular channels. So I was like, I'm not finding anybody that's, I'll just say conservative just for ease of communication, but, not falling into that left leaning category. I'm like, for some reason, there's only left leaning ex Mormons. There's a big space for me to come in. And then, of course, once I, got on YouTube, then I found a lot of people,
Right, but
although smaller.
it does feel to me like it's almost like an alternative to the ex-Mormon space. Is that we've got people who are exploring things and or what to do post Mormondom that's not quite so monolithic, I guess. Just we want to find the truth. It feels like, and not so much get wrapped up in some of the fighting and politics, is what it feels like to me.
Yeah, definitely. And I almost had the feeling I try to always remind myself because I do think there's a little bit of a problem, but it's like leaving ex-Mormonism, and I think we both somewhat identify as atheists. I've heard you say that, but like every atheist, it's like yes, but depending on how you define it, yes.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. It's, yeah, I would say exactly that, that it's like, I'll say an atheist as it relates to the Abrahamic notions of God, the same way I feel about
Perfect.
Zeus is pretty much the same way I feel about those notions. But you start talking about like a idealistic notion of God or something like that. Well, then you're getting into stuff that's not quite so amenable to laying out his claims. It's, you can't really go and check a checklist against it like I think you can with the Abrahamic gods because there's certain claims being made. And so then I switch from being, well, I'm not really an atheist now. Now I'm more of a militant agnostic where I'm like, I don't know and you don't know either. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Where was I going to go with that? But yeah, it seems like we both fall into that same category, and with that category, it's a very limited scope of what we are kind of claiming, and it's just weird to me that all these people that are becoming atheists or ex-Mormons tend to all be in the same group after the fact. Does that make sense? Like, it's like, hey, I thought we all were just saying no to that, and so I would expect us to have an array of opinions on everything else. But instead, there's this thing where you say no to that thing, and then we all are on the same team after, and it's like, I
Yeah.
think there's a little bit of groupthink going on after you leave.
Absolutely. I mean, so my own kind of story with, the ex-Mormon community is that I went away for like 20, 25 years. I wasn't even paying attention to Mormondom at all for a long time. I went off and kind of found my way among the new atheists and the skeptics and kind of found my meaning over there, even though most of my family was behind staying with the Mormon group. And then I came back because of recent family events and started re-engaging with Mormonism, with kind of the ex-Mormon community. And coming back, I'm like, oh, this is very, very different than it was, 20, 25 years ago. People can talk about things that they weren't able to talk about before. But I also think there's this more sense of community, that the people over there are actually trying to form an alternative to, what they just left from leaving the LDS church. And I'm not so sure that that's a good idea, just based on my experience with having been in the New Atheist group, which then kind of broke out and developed into Atheism Plus, which brought in all that social justice stuff and tried to become a community built around these social justice, atheistic, secular ideals. And that, well, actually, I guess that did join up with the woke movement that we see now. But I kind of think the ex-Mormon group that we see over there, with DeLynne's group, and the Thrive group leans that way. They're not 100% that way, but you see enough of it that I'm kind of like, the parallels are very obvious to me. Over here, we got the Atheism Plus group, and over here, we've got kind of this ex-Mormon Thrive social justice advocacy group too.
Yeah. Also, by the way, if you hear my dogs barking, I apologize.
It's cool.
So I definitely want to dive into that, because I think that's one of the unique perspectives that you bring, is that you left, and I was listening to the conversation you had with my brother, and so you give a little bit of your background there. So it seems like you left in the late 90s. Is that right?
Yeah. So I served my mission to Busan, Korea. We'll just pick up the story there. That was from 88 to 90. I was in the MTC, I think the same time as John DeLynne was, incidentally. In fact, someday if I ever talk to him, I want to see if I played a little stunt while I was at the MTC, where I went up on the stand got my companion come up and sat in empty chairs up on the stand during a large group meeting when Elder Pinniger was in charge of the MTC. And he comes by and he says, "Oh, what are you guys doing sitting up here?" I said, "I just noticed some empty seats. I'm going to sit up here." Right. And he says, "Oh, that's fine." And then in that meeting, he called myself up and he did this little skit where he was like trying to present me with the Book of Mormon in front of, the whole large group meeting. He's like, "Oh, I just want you to know, Elder Leavitt," and all these great things about the Book of Mormon. And then right when I would go to take it, I'd go, "Oh, and one more thing," and I'd pull it away and I'd reach for it. And we went this back and forth, kind of this little skit. And it was all unplanned, unprepared.
Well,
and then I heard
John remembers that.
Yeah, I was wondering if John DeLynne was there and saw that happen. And then I heard that he made that was it Rex Pinniger? I can't remember. Well, Pinniger, whoever it was. Ed Pinniger. Every time after that, he started making that a regular thing. And I was like, oh, I was the first guy to do it with him,
Oh, nice.
Anyway, so I was in the FTC in 88 to 90, went on my mission 88 to 90 in Korea, came home, got married to the girl that I dated before I left, only 4 months later. So I was married at the young age of 21 in the Las Vegas Temple, very much, LDS. But, I was at BYU on a scholarship, but then around 91, things started to kind of crack a little bit. By 93, when my then wife was pregnant, is when I started to get I got to get serious about kind of figuring things out with my doubts. And then the September 6th thing happened in 93, and Steve Benson,
I was born in 93.
Okay, so there you go. Wow, that tells me how old you are. Yeah, so Steve Benson, that's when he came out and resigned from the church.
Okay.
And he talked about how his grandfather was being portrayed, Ezra Taft Benson. And at the time, he was very kind of sick and senile, but the church was kind of propping him up as oh, he's fine, he's healthy, right? So he actually kind of called them out on that. So that started my faith journey out. And from 93 to 96, I was pretty quiet. I didn't really say much to friends or family. But back then, there wasn't an internet. There wasn't a community. There wasn't anything to go to. So I was sneaking over, and it felt like sneaking to the special collections section at the University of Utah Library, because I had left BYU by then, to look up these things and find out what's going on here with all my questions I have. It was a lot of CES letter stuff, but back then it wasn't all consolidated. You had to go and find it from different books and things. And by 96, I was like, I don't think I believe this anymore. And I started to come out to the family in 96. And it was very much like coming out. So there's kind of my time frame. But then shortly thereafter, from 96 forward, I said, well, now that I don't really believe Mormonism, what is it that I do believe in? And I went off on my own journey, and I started reading a lot of books about science, religion. And the next thing I knew, I was, reading Carl Sagan and then Richard Dawkins. And from there, I was on my way towards the New Atheist movement. So that's kind of my history there.
So was your, I guess, beginning of your faith crisis, faith journey, however you want to refer to it, was that based mostly just on intellectual curiosity, or you had a few things that were like, hey, this is I'm confused about this. Then you looked it up, then it wasn't good. Then that was just kind of an unraveling.
Yeah, actually, I think that I traced the roots of my faith crisis to my mission, but it wasn't doctrinal. what it was is on my mission, I had a very open attitude. I was a very gung-ho missionary, by the way. I placed 2 copies of the Book of Mormon on the plane flight over to people that were around me, and I
Nice.
placed over 700 copies while I was there. I
Wow.
was very much go go go, and it was a great mission. I really loved my mission to Korea because I was in a small town on an island, right? So it
So
was very
I
rural.
actually spent a little bit of time in Korea, including
Oh,
Busan.
awesome!
Um,
Yes.
so I love it, and I do know that the Korean people are pretty Christian. So did that translate to a pretty successful Mormon tradition as well?
Well, that's what I was going for, was that while I was there on my mission, as I started talking to other people, I realized, hey, these other people, they really believe in what they say they believe in, just like we do, right? And I
Okay.
started to get into this whole all these different religions, and I met with them because I was so gung ho. I was meeting with the Moonies. The Moonies were there.
Oh
They're
wow.
quite prominent in Korea. The Jehovah's Witnesses, meeting with them. I was meeting with a few other, like there was an upstart group in the late '80s that saw Korea as a promised land and end times was coming. So I was meeting with them. Plus, I was just meeting with all the regular, Presbyterians and Baptists and
Mhm.
and mostly the Christianized Korea, which had been Christianized because of the Korean War. And as I met with them, I kept realizing how much they really believed in it, and that got me thinking about epistemology without knowing that was the word I was thinking of. Like, how do you know what's true? These people really believe it just like I do. And so I dug in, especially into the Jehovah's Witnesses. I really, while on my mission, I really started looking into their stuff. And I started to think, if I was raised a Jehovah's Witness and this is what I was taught, it all coheres and kind of sticks together pretty well, provided you're inside that bubble already. And so then I started thinking, well, what about me and my Mormondom? Right. And that was really the impetus, was that I started to recognize that it's possible that I might believe what I believe just because of my accident of birth or where I was born. That maybe if I'd been born somewhere else or a different religion, I would believe that. And to me, I started to think even then on my mission that the way to resolve it was via some sort of appeal to reality or appeal to evidence when you have these different religious groups. And to be honest, I think once you think that, once you start thinking empirically, most religions are in big trouble, no matter what they believe, because now you're going to start thinking, well, where's the claims? What's the evidence? How can we
Mhm.
find out? And religions just generally don't hold up very well once you do that.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I've actually heard multiple people. Um, I can't remember who it is off the top of my head, but they said like reading um, the book on Scientology was actually like, once you start seeing these parallels between a group that you think is like, oh, that makes no sense, and then you realize that there's a ton of parallels to the way you're acting.
Yes.
And now I draw those parallels all the time, and I probably was doing it at the time of my faith journey as well. But like recently, there was a new Waco, I think like 3-part miniseries on Netflix that just came out. And every time I learn about Waco and the Branch Davidians, I always am seeing parallels. Um, and of course, that's somewhat offensive just because one's a cult and one's not, or you get into the cult debate. But you start to realize that in all these groups where there's devout followers into something that resembles a religion, that there are parallels between all of them, and that can be damaging for someone for the first time if they've never seen other face. Coming across that kind of stuff, they see that connection.
Yeah, when I was in Korea on my mission, in the ward house that we had actually in Yeongdo, the Pusan ward was right adjacent to the Moonies church. We shared a wall with them. They had a meeting house. So they had a bunch of Americans there who had been, married off. Like there was a Chinese American who had married a guy from Germany, and he was learning English so that he could speak to his new wife because they had been paired off. And so we would talk to them, like about Moon Sun Myung and what the Moonies believed. And they believed it just as strong as we did. They would cry, they would get upset. They knew that the person that they had been married to, who they had never met before in their lives, was preordained, right? They knew that person was the only way they could have found him was through the church. So that emotional conviction, and whenever somebody said that they were emotionally convicted, I started to say, yeah, I believe you have that feeling, but I don't think that's a reliable indicator of truth, no matter how strong it is, right? And that's pretty damaging when you turn that microscope back on yourself and
Oh
say,
yeah.
I've had these strong experiences, and I really do think I had a lot of spiritual experiences, but I started to question them myself as like, I think these are being brought on more by my psychology than by, external causes.
Yeah, and that's something that I think my family, including my brother Jacob, we've had to fight with. Is he agrees that you can't just say, "Oh, because I feel it, it's true."
Right.
And I think for a lot of us, that is what brought down our faith. Because I do believe that the Mormon Church really relies on that mechanism to convert people, and I think that a lot of religious institutions do. And once you realize that, like, hey, we're all pulling the same card and we can't all be correct, then you start to have to, like, hey, how else can we resolve this issue? And like you're saying, that's when you start going the scientific route, and then it becomes much harder to substantiate your claims.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe why I didn't get stuck in the in kind of the Mormon rut that I see some other people get stuck in. They leave the church and they can't leave it alone. They kind of have to circle on the church isn't just wrong, it's bad, right? So they spend a lot of time attacking it again and again and tearing it down. And you'll see it happen for 15, 20 years, and they'll still define themselves as an ex-Mormon. And I didn't want to be an ex anything. I wanted to figure out what it was that I believed, not what it was that I didn't believe. But I think that I think there's a real lure to just validate your disbelief once you leave and get stuck on a treadmill. But for me, because I had approached it scientifically, I thought, well, what are the claims that the LDS Church makes? And I lined them all up, make a little chart, spreadsheet. What's the evidence for it? For and against, pro and con. Preponderance of the evidence seems to indicate to me that this is not a good, that's really how I did it. And so once I reached
And I'm
that
sure
point,
that was
I
a
just,
lot harder in the late 90s than it is with the CES letter, access to all this
yeah.
information now.
When I saw the CES letter, because I stumbled across it in like 2014 or something, somebody was talking about, oh, this is great. And I was like, wow, this is great. This is amazing. I wrote Jeremy Runnels, I said, wow, this is really great. You put this together. This was the sort of stuff I was trying to collect back in the 90s. And he was like, yeah, thanks.
That's awesome.
So I thought the CS letters was a beautiful kind of consolidation of a lot of
Oh,
issues.
yeah, I totally agree. And it's kind of the reason I go back and forth a little bit on my channel about it, but like I'm not too interested in discussing that stuff because I really do feel like the CES letter just nailed it. It's like I don't know what I could add. Um, it's like every video I could just be like, go read the CES letter on this topic, and that's what I'm going to present.
Yeah, I find the CS letter it's not really comprehensive and goes into all the little like corners and alleys that you could get into, but it just basically lays out the main claims of the church against some troubling bits of evidence, and it's enough to get you going, this may not add up the way that I was told, and that's usually all it takes for a lot of people to start the rough stone rolling before you're run over by it.
So, do you have anything else on your history? That was actually my first question, is kind of explain your background. Is there anything else that you'd like to discuss before we get into some other stuff?
No, we can move on, but I do think at some time, it may be fun to talk about some of the new atheist stuff, because that was a really fun time there at the amazing meeting. Before there was the atheism and the atheism plus, there was that little group around James Randi and the magicians and stuff that was really just about skepticism and science. And to me, it was like that spirit of Carl Sagan was there, where people weren't trying to destroy religion. They weren't defined as atheists. They were defined as were scientific skeptics. And they were just trying to understand the world. And so for a while, it's like, oh, this is so great. It was almost like we had a new community, but then it got kind of overtaken by the atheist movement, and the new atheist.
So, I mean, some of this, I
yeah.
feel like I'm getting educated because I claim to be an atheist and I claim to be a part of that new atheist movement, not atheism plus. But really, to me, it kind of begins with Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins. I
And
haven't
my
really
favorite,
read much of Daniel
Dan
Dennett.
Dan Dennett.
Is your favorite?
Everybody should read more Dan Dennett. Yeah.
Yeah, I do think of all of them, he's the least recognized. And I don't say that because it's justified, but that's how it seems.
Yeah, Dan Dennett. And if you're an ex-Mormon and you like the others, you should really read Dan Dennett, because he is the least confrontational towards religion out of all of them.
Maybe that's why he's the least well known.
Yeah, I think it is. But his approach was, he saw religion as a natural phenomenon, as something that happens to humans all around the world, and so we should study it as a natural phenomenon. As like we do with art or music, or he used examples of the religious institutions should be subject to the same scrutiny as pharmaceutical industries or oil industries, right? So he had this approach of religion shouldn't be shelled off as something special. We should be able to dig into it. And he even promoted, as an atheist, the teaching of religion in schools, because he thought everybody should learn about all the different religions of the world. He saw it as valuable to our whole history of humanity. So I really like his approach. He has different views on free will than Sam Harris does. And I think Dan Dennett's views are much more accurate because he's a professor of cognitive philosophy. And so, he knows what he's talking about. Anyway, Dan Dennett is kind of my favorite of those new atheists.
Interesting, because I actually did listen to I can't remember who the conversation was with, but it was about compatibilism, and I wasn't really sold on it. And I think maybe I like the confrontational style or something, but yeah, he just hasn't grabbed my attention the way the other guys have. But that doesn't mean that his arguments aren't good, and I shouldn't look into it more for sure.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to talk briefly about compatibilism, because I think the main issue with free will is as we get stuck on semantic decisions, or definitions, I should say, the semantics of what is free will. The way Sam Harris defines it is that it's, basically free will has to be non-deterministic, the way he tends to define it. Like it's something that happens outside this deterministic kind of wave of stuff that's always happening along. And since we don't see evidence of happening outside of determinism, we don't have any. Dan Dennett says, well, it's your definition of free will that's kind of ridiculous. He's like, why are you defining it as something that exists outside of materialism? He's saying maybe free will can exist inside this materialistic, deterministic universe. It's just that we need to change our definitions. And so Dan Dennett's definition, and this is kind of my paraphrase, a better way to think of free will is capacity for considered action, not necessarily, like the ability to pop outside of your deterministic boundaries. So, for example, I have more free will than a rock, because a rock has no capacity for considered action. Like if something's coming at a rock, it's just going to hit it. But if something's coming at me, I have a little bit of free will to maybe dodge out of the way. And so that's what he's talking about is freedom evolves. You get more and more free will as creatures develop more and more abilities to understand and consider their world. So
yeah, I think was it him that was talking about it's kind of like degrees of freedom, like in
yes,
like a like an arm can move so many different ways, and we as humans have more degrees of freedom than a rock.
Exactly. And so that's what he's saying. And that's how we use free will in our day-to-day anyway. Like if you're in a contract, like if tomorrow, Forrest, you're going down to get married, they would ask, do you sign this of your own free will and choice? And when they say that, free will and choice, they don't mean it in, a deterministic way. They just mean, are you sober? Are you being pressured into this? Is there anything that would impinge upon your capacity for considered action, right? That's what we mean when we say free will. And that's how we usually mean it when we use it anyway. So Dan Dennett talks about free will and makes a case for why we can have free will, and that free will is even improving over time in our deterministic universe. So he's, he runs against Sam Harris in that way.
Yeah. The counter, well, the definition debates are always hard, but the counter I've heard is that some people, and I think I agree with this, when I say free will, and I think when a lot of people say free will, it means that they had the ability to do otherwise. Like if we rewound the clock and had the universe set in the same exact way, could we get to a different endpoint? Right now, at whatever time it is right now, like if we went back an hour, could I have done something different than I did to get to this point right now? And I don't know.
Yeah.
I think the answer is no, because I am maybe defining it that certain way, but I do believe in a deterministic universe.
Right. And to me, I think that the example you just gave is one that you hear a lot. Like, well, you couldn't change it because everything was predetermined and the situation was identical, right? So it would play out the same way. But again, I think we're slipping into we're looking for something to break the deterministic mold in order for free will to exist. And I think Dan Dennett is saying, no, free will isn't something that you look back in retrospect. It's actually the capacity to do something while you're experiencing, so that you have sight, so you can respond visually. So you have more freedom than if you were blind. You can hear, so you have more opportunities. So he's got a book, Freedom Evolves, right here, that I think is totally worth
a mandatory reading for all wannabe atheists.
Well, it's reading if you're into the freedom thing. That one's also signed.
Oh, nice. So, I have to be honest, the free will discussion to me, one, I just haven't really gotten into it too much, and partially because I don't know, to me, it doesn't seem like it changes anything, and the best justification I have is Christopher Hitchens' like common like turn of phrase, not turn of phrase, but like quip that he would have, which is, "I can't do otherwise." Which is like, even, wherever we come on this free will thing, it feels like we have free will, so we're just gonna act as if we have free will.
Right.
So, and I am interested in it, but it's been one of those like giant things that I'm like, I don't know if I'm ready to really dive into this just yet.
Yeah, and I don't know, like we can go down this rabbit hole a little bit, but to me, once you start to realize that what you think of as your conscious experience is really just part of your default mode network, it's up here. It's kind of that part that comes at the end of the chain. Most of your decisions are being made at a subconscious level. Jonathan Haidt talks about, speaking to the elephant. Most of your decisions are happening subconsciously. They can actually, put little electrodes on your head and make predictions about choices that you'll make 6 or 7 seconds before you're even aware of your own decision. Just to kind of prove this point that what
And
we
I
think
think,
of free will is at the end of the chain. It's already been
yeah.
decided somewhere earlier. Yeah.
Um, do you listen to or watch the Cosmic Skeptic, Alex O'Connor?
Yeah. Yeah. That guy's pretty good.
So
Yeah.
I really like him, and I did not take the skeptic thing from him, but it's like you can't coin the term skeptic in your YouTube handle. So I took it with no qualms. Anyways, um, he had probably the strongest. He made a against free will argument um, that I super agree with, and it actually is influencing. I'm actually going to put out, I think, a 3-part series on morality, and I take that from kind of his argument for free will or against free will, and I want to run it by you to see what you think. It's
Sure.
basically the idea that the only way we can do something is if we want to or if we're forced to. So, something as simple as like moving your hand to pick up a glass of water. You have to want to do that. Or you have to, like, someone grabs your hand and moves it. Um and then that's premise number 1. Premise number 2 is that we don't choose our wants. Like right now, all the things that you want in your life, like you didn't pick them, it just kind of starts to emerge out of you. And then I think it's therefore we do. It's basically therefore we don't choose our actions because they are emergent from what we want, and since we don't choose our wants, then our actions are not able to be chosen. I guess I need to like actually pull it up and have the real thing, but that's the basic argument. And I was like, I think I follow you every step of the way there.
Yeah. I smell what you're cooking there, right? Yeah, I agree very much with what you're saying, and I think that does make sense. That a lot of what we do is just, yeah, it's bubbling up from our subconscious into a level where we become aware of it. And when we say we, it's really just that part of our brain that's utilized for speaking to other people. That's the part that we usually associate with being our central self. But our self is much more than just kind of that, verbal speaking part. And that's part of what I think, and part of what I believe I've experienced through meditation and stuff, is this recognition that what we think of as consciousness, I think therefore I am, from Descartes, is really just part of our conscious experience. It's just kind of a little bit of it, and it's actually a broader. And I think when you have that recognition that your conscious experience is more than just the neurolinguistic part of you, that the little voice in your head, but it's also what you see, what you hear, what you feel. You start to settle in, or at least for me, and accept that you are actually a electro-neurobiological process running inside this machine, this wonderful, beautiful human machine. And you start, I don't know, to me, it like starts to become really amazing. I get those Carl Sagan kind of tingly vibes about, hey, I'm a way for the universe to know itself. And I hear people struggling with meaning, and I find myself going, yeah, but the universe is just so freaking cool that the for me, just learning about it like gets me
Yeah.
excited.
And I think maybe that's another thing that I think maybe we share, is, to me, getting away from religion has made things better. It makes things more beautiful. enjoy life more. It makes me see things in like a, I don't know. I think the universe without God is a more beautiful universe than a universe that was created this way. It's just like more amazing that it could possibly happen.
Yes, yeah, I totally agree. And it's one of those things that it almost makes it for me, it gives me a strange sense of gratitude. Like the thought that we really did come about through, these amazing combination of tremendous, both chemical interactions over millions and billions of years through the stardust that's in, all of our cells. That whole crazy thing about how the
Yeah.
materialists describe the universe, to me sounds so rich and amazing and interesting that I almost feel like it cheapens it to go in and try and say, yeah, but really none of it matters, and it's secret little spiritual gremlins running it all or whatever. And I'm like, why do you do that? I guess it's because as humans, we want to have some sort of hyper tribe sensitivity. We want to believe that we're part of something big and important, and our life has great meaning that is external to us, rather than just recognizing being alive in itself is a wonderful gift. And there's gratitude, I think, just for being able to be here for a split second, even if it's all snuffed out later. That's okay. you know I'm okay to stare the face of death in the eyes and say, yeah, I'll be wiped out, and that's okay. I enjoy
And
while I'm here. Yeah.
one of my favorite thoughts about death is, it's kind of a strange thing to say, but I love the idea that it's basically that you should never fear something that you'll never experience, and you will never experience your death. So it's irrational to fear death. You can fear dying.
Right.
Dying may be painful, who knows? But death itself, you won't even know. And or another way of putting it is that death will be as great as it is when you're asleep. It's
Yes.
like
Yeah.
people love to go to bed, and people are like, "Oh, this is, oh, I can't wait till I go to bed tonight." And then they're super afraid of death, and I'm like, I don't know if there's much of a difference. Um, and also, so have you seen? I'm assuming you've seen Jeff Durbin and Apologia Studios, that crowd.
Yeah, is that the Calvinist group?
Yeah, it's a Calvinist group.
Yeah.
He loves to say, "Oh, you just think you're stardust. How stupid is that?" And you came from fish. How stupid is that? I'm like, no, that's amazing.
You're right. It's amazing.
I'm like,
and,
you're
and it
saying it like you're mocking it, but to me, that comes off as amazing. Like, we came from fish. That's not an insult. That's like, is that true? If that's true, that is wild. That is
yeah.
amazing.
And I mean, we're kind of sliding towards the theory of evolution, but the theory of evolution is beautiful. Like there's always these attacks on it. Your brother's doing a series of attacking it all the time. I've
Yeah.
seen him a couple times, and it kind of gets under my skin because they're like, this evolution thing, because it collides with the religious views they want to have, they're always turned down. But if you look at what evolution tells us about ourselves, it ties us in to nature. It makes us, we all share DNA. That tree outside the door, it's got DNA in it just like I do.
Well,
And
and for some reason, it seems
that's
like
fantastic.
yeah, it almost, that's the piece that it hinges on. Is being part of nature fantastic, or is being the same as nature just makes you as crappy as the dirt outside?
Right.
And it depends on your perspective on that, whether evolution is beautiful or evolution is, diminishing.
Yeah. And maybe that's part of the detriments of religion, is that I think it, especially, like a religion like Mormonism, it gives you this eschatology of a plan of salvation. You've got this huge, wonderful plan. It's all laid out. And then when that's taken away from you, or you start to challenge it, you can't imagine anything that isn't as grand or sweeping, that makes demotes humans to just little things instead of the center of the entire universe, where these little specks on this little pale blue dot around this insignificant solar system on the corner of this galaxy that doesn't really matter as far as we can tell. And for somebody who's been raised in like, well, no, the entire universe is all about you. It's all about man. It's all about humans. It's just heartbreaking. And it seems like they can't accept what I think is the beauty of reality because they've been poisoned by this need for something grandiose that's actually a substitute for what I think is even more grandiose.
Yeah, it's interesting
reality.
though how
Yeah.
it's like it's a hard point to argue because it is almost like it's like, you know, it's not a scientific argument. It's just like, I just think this is beautiful. I think this is, you know, art. It's like trying to argue that one picture is prettier than another picture. But I totally agree with you that I have seemed to think that things are more amazing since leaving religion.
Yeah, when I went down the creation evolution rabbit hole, because I went pretty far down that as I was leaving the church, because I used to be really in the creation camp, and then I, of course, studied it. Now I'm in the evolution camp. Now I feel like I have a better understanding. But just discovering all the things about your body and where they came from. Like, for example, you have a nerve called the otolaryngeal nerve that goes from the back of your brain. It loops down under your heart and then comes back up to innervate your throat here,
Yeah,
right? Yeah, and in a giraffe, it goes clear from their brain all the way down their neck, around their heart, and then all the way back up to their throat. And, you know, from an intelligent designer, that makes no sense at all. You know, 14 foot of nerve to run this thing when it's only, you know, that far away. But from an evolutionary standpoint, it explains why you would have this ridiculous nerve, because over time, when we were fish, it was a short distance. But then, you know, over time, evolution's always working with what it's got. The nerve gets longer and longer and longer. We get necks, and then one day you've got a nerve looping around your heart and coming back up.
Yeah, it's not going
that's freaking
the
cool.
Intelligently designed way.
Exactly.
Whether it evolved.
But even though it's not intelligently designed, it's still amazing. And you have a story and an explanation for the evidence you see. You don't have to like try and deny the evidence. You can say, oh, we know why that happened. We have a good story for it, and it fits all the data.
Yeah, I love that. I did want to dive into, we touched on free will a little bit. I guess also would like to touch on morality, which is something that I seem to, for some reason, have a addictive fascination with. Especially once you leave religion, I feel like it's one of those questions I think you were hinting at. Like once you leave, you have to like find new answers to these things. Yes. And I do think that atheists have kind of a problem of taking the moral problem a little bit too lightly. They leave and it's kind of like, oh, morality is obvious. Like we should just do these things that I believe personally, and that's the obvious moral decision. And there's no like real justification for it. Do you agree with that at all? Or do you think that atheists do have, you know, is it a lot of work to find a framework for morality from an atheist perspective? Or do you think that there's plenty of puzzle pieces to put together?
My thought is that moral philosophy and all of morality is a very human endeavor, right? And to me, that's very important to remember, because I don't see it in terms of, you know, complete black or white or gray. It's more like an evolving technology that started back, you know, way back in our tribal states and has come forward. And so to me, just approaching morality with the understanding of it is going to be a gray area. It's going to be more like art or music or something, because it's a human endeavor, helps you to come at it with, I'm not trying to look for absolutes. I'm trying to look for just making things a little better. And are we making things better from a moral standpoint? Because I know, you know, from usually we get into this really black and white right away, what's right, what's wrong. And I'm saying, well, maybe morality is more about interaction and less about these clear designations of right and wrong. Once you make that switch, and I think a lot of kind of your long-term atheists or whatever have made that switch. They're already thinking in terms of kind of shades of gray. And so then they look to guidance for, you know, combination of empathy, combination of reason, combination of philosophy, and all these different things. So I don't think it's like an easy answer, but I think it's a rewarding and productive field to explore, right? So it doesn't feel like a problem to be solved. It seems more like an adventure to be had. Does that make sense? Like,
no,
I think discovering why we're moral is exciting, and what is moral.
I think it makes sense. And I think it makes sense why someone coming from religion to atheism feels like they need to have these standards. Like to me, you know, a religious person is looking like, hey, where's like the list of do's and don'ts on the wall that I can look at?
Right. Where's my 10 commandments? Yeah.
Yeah. Where's my 10 commandments? And I'm bringing part of this up because I watched originally when I first saw you, it was actually the conversation you had with my brother on morality. And my first thought was, I'm like, okay, before you started talking at all, I was like, okay, Jacob just has some guy on to talk, some atheist, and he's, you know, going to be taking this too lightly and Jacob's going to whoop on him. And then you had awesome responses. And this is before I was on YouTube and I was commenting. I was like, Troy, you did an awesome job. Good work. I thought you did a really good job at presenting, like, A, how this is gray, and B, how it's like, even though it's gray, you still have some building blocks to play with.
Yeah, it was. I enjoyed that conversation, but I also felt like in talking to your brother that he had read just enough to be a little bit dangerous in different things. Like he'd read some Hume, some Nietzsche and stuff, but he hadn't read deeply enough into Hume to say, well, actually, Hume has a solution to the is-ought thing, and that is it's our moral sentiments, and he has a whole theory built around moral sentiments, but he didn't know where those sentiments came from, right? And so I think that's where I start to go, well, we do have moral sentiments. We can look around the whole planet, see that most of us share the same ideals, the same interests, the same. Well, where'd that come from? And now we're talking into evolutionary psychology and tribal thoughts about in-group, out-group sort of preference, and it makes sense. That doesn't mean there's an absolute answer, but it makes sense with what we see. And then if you start thinking, okay, so we're getting better at this as humans, right? Just like tools, just like other things that we've developed, we're getting better at our moral philosophy as we expand it. And really the key is cooperation is a competitive advantage. And that's enough for us to drive ever widening circles until hopefully we're at a species level where every individual matters and we're all part of the same human tribe. That's, my happy approach to the whole thing. I hope.
Well, I don't know if I had an interview with my brother Danny the other day.
Yes,
and something that I brought up, and I really think this is the case, is that as our technology increases and our world becomes smaller, through technology mostly, and even travel, like that human, our tribe is increasing in scope.
Yes.
Like before, it was like the other side of the world was basically another world. You didn't care about them. You didn't even know about them. Now the other side of the world is somewhere you can go tomorrow on vacation if you want. So you have an emotional connection to them now, and that's why they're a part of your tribe.
Yes.
And so I agree with you, and I think luckily because of technology, our tribe has kind of grown into the human scope, and that's why you find atheists and people arguing for humanism, because they feel the connection with humanity.
Yeah, I went all the way back on my mission, I go to Korea, very, very different place, different language. I was living with all Koreans. But what I picked up on very quickly is, hey, they love their kids too, right? They have all the same joys and all the same fears that we do. And you suddenly realize they're not different than me at all, right? It's like they are me, or we are all the same species. We're so closely related that the things that we tear each other apart, these little demographic markers about race and gender and things, seem really insignificant to me. Like, I'm like, why are we so hung up on such minor things? I'm like, oh yeah, that's the tribalism of our past, rearing its ugly head. We need to move beyond that ugly tribalism based around demographics and try and see each other as individual, unique humans. Once we do that, individual, unique human rights as best we can, then I think we're on the right path. And that's why I'm in that kind of humanist approach to things. Although I'm not really a joiner, I'm always kind of, anthropologizing things, like this is how I think it works, but nice. That's how I think I fit in. Yeah.
and this is something that Jacob brought up a bunch of times that honestly has become a theme of my channel. I feel like and it's basically the idea that the complaints that are tossed at atheism, religious people don't have the answer either. And I'm not saying like they don't have the answer because none of us really know anything. I'm saying even if I accept your premise, it still doesn't solve the problem. And one of the examples that he was talking about was, he was like, if I became, this is a quote, I literally was watching this like an hour ago. It was like, if I became an atheist, I would be a radical individualist and I would just care about my own well-being. And under Jacob's moral philosophy, and I think most people, and I'll explain why I think this, I think most people are individualists and they do care about their individual well-being. But what's hardly ever recognized and often is brought up as like a theoretical counter, but it's not real life, is if I only care about myself, then I'll do, if I could get away with something, I'll do that. And this is where even somebody like Jordan Peterson is like, you can never get away with something, even to yourself. Like you'll feel bad that you did that. And so I always wonder, like, a good counter is if you were going to go to heaven and your well-being was worse off, would you want to go to, would going to heaven be the moral decision? And I think most people are going to say, wait, you're telling me I'll be less happy in heaven than, we'll just say hell because it's the other thing. So if I'm going to be less well off in heaven than I would be in hell, I think the clear moral decision is to go to the place that you'll have more well-being. And it'd be interesting. I'm pretty sure my brother would agree with me that wherever has better well-being is the place you go. But that just shows that they're not escaping the individualist well-being problem. Like we're
Right.
all looking for well-being on an individual level.
Yeah, and I've heard your brother and others go down that radical individualist path that well, if I didn't believe in God, it'd be all about me, and I would basically try and get away with all that I can, right? But we know that that's not true. Actually, that's what people think they would do, but their emotions and their conscience is going to trip them up along the way because that's built in to your very being, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't work.
Well, maybe I would say they would try to get away with all they can, but luckily they can't get away with much because you have a
Right?
conscience.
Yes. Yeah, evolution, I would say, has equipped you with this over thousands and thousands of generations for you to feel certain ways about how you interact with other people. And it's mostly around that small tribe. So if you're out there doing bad things, you either have to really believe that the person you're doing it to, harming, is of an exterior tribe, or you're going to feel super bad about it because your own conscious won't let you, right? You've got that baked into you. There's also a part of this radical individualism that obviously doesn't hold up right away, because most people, and I bet you're one of these, they would very willingly die for a family member or support a family member. They will self-sacrifice emotionally immediately for somebody else who might be in danger, just automatically, like they don't even have to think about it. Evolution has a good explanation for that because you share genes with your kin, or you might be supporting your tribe. So it's built in, baked into you that you would, die for a child, or you might, support a parent or whatever, these sorts of things you'd sacrifice for yourself. But if you were just purely a radical individualist without that built-in conscience, then you'd probably just run off like an insect or something when it reached a certain age, and you wouldn't even care about being part of a community or anything. So I guess what I'm trying to say is the fact that we are social, communal animals, right, is where our moral compass really derives itself from. And there's a lot of studies that are showing this in evolutionary psychology. A lot of the books and stuff coming out are like, yeah, this is where our morality comes from, baked into us.
Yeah. It's almost like these theoretical examples. It's like, if I wasn't a human, then, and this happened, then I would
Right.
just be an individualist. It's like, but you are a human, and we're talking about, as humans, how should we act?
Right. Like when I was on their channel, they started giving me the Mormon version of a trolley problem, where they were saying, if you're alone on a desert island with a pretty woman, but she doesn't want to have sex with you, but you're the last two people left in the universe, what do you do? And I'm like, well, this is like a trolley problem, right? They're trying to put you in this very particular situation to find out where your limits are emotionally, figuring this stuff out. But I'm like, yeah, but that situation is never going to happen, first of all. And you're looking for nice, clear, black and white answers so that you can tease out some sort of moral absolutism, and you're not going to find it, right?
Well,
And
and this is exactly what I'm trying to get at.
yeah,
Is
yeah,
what I would love is whenever those questions are asked, ask them back. Like the trolley problem. Does Mormonism have an answer to the trolley problem?
no.
No, and they'll give you these hard dilemmas, and like I feel like a lot of atheists are kind of on their heels, like trying to give a good answer. Like I don't want to commit too much, but I don't want to act like I have no framework. And we forget that, like, wait a minute, even with your black and white moral standards, you have gray all over the place.
Right. Yes.
It's like most of the hardest moral dilemmas that are talked about in moral philosophy or in ethics courses, Mormonism would be stumped they don't have an answer. You could read
Yes.
the scriptures all you want, and it's not going to give you a good answer to the trolley problem.
Yeah, that's why those trolley problems are so great, because they point out to you that you're not really sitting there making rational calculations of what's wrong or right. You're having a quick emotional response to something going on, and then you start to justify that response after you've already had it. Because like you've said on the trolley problem, there's a very clear difference when they test people about whether you throw a switch to put a person on the track, or whether you push somebody, right? And if it's the same end result, but if you push somebody on the tracks, man, that feels a lot worse than throwing a switch that drives it into somebody else. But it's the same end result. And the only way you can explain things like that is it's built into our emotions, right? It's not a rational decision.
And that, I feel like there's two people in the moral game. The people that are actually wrestling with these, and they're like people like you, where it's like, I don't have a perfect answer, but I'm on this journey and I'm trying to figure it out. And then there's the people that pretend that they do have the answer. And even when you ask them these hard questions, they don't have the answer. So I don't know. For one, I give you respect for going on their channel and being able to, you did a great job articulating from an atheist perspective how you can still have, it's almost like you still have pieces on the chessboard to play with. You're not starting, it's not completely arbitrary. Like you have moves you can make, but it is complicated and it is hard.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good analogy. Yeah, you're kind of, well, I talked to your brother about Camus, and his whole philosophy is of absurdism. To me, it's just accepting the universe as it really is, and then trying to work within the parameters of the universe as it really is. And that's why I also like Carl Sagan, who used to say, better to accept the hard truth than the comforting fantasy. And so to me, I just want to understand the universe as it really is, even if it's ugly, even if there's something that's bad, even if it doesn't work out the way that I thought it should. Just the value of knowing the universe as it really is what kind of drives me in my search for understanding. And the discovery post Mormondom is that actually it's really cool. There's so much that's out there, and it's so interesting that I don't feel like I lost that much from an intellectual standpoint. Definitely lost quite a bit from a communal standpoint, right? But just from understanding the universe, I don't think losing Mormonism made me feel like I lost a handle on what the universe was.
Yeah. I'll just tease real quick. I think my next videos that I'm going to release are going to be, it'll be like a 3-part series on a moral theory that I have. And I'm very curious to see what you think about it once I present it. I'm not going to present it now just because it's pretty complicated, but it's the idea. Do you know eudaimonia, Aristotle's?
Yeah.
At the bottom of why are we doing anything? It's kind of, is it well-being, or it's the idea that it's actually, I call it the theory of wants, or it's your want. And it's basically at the bottom of everything. There's this root want that we have. And wanting something, for example, wanting well-being is completely different than well-being itself. And everybody conflates those two, and actually the want precedes. But that's just the teaser for it. It'll come out soon. I don't want to get too far into that, but
no, I think that sounds great. Yeah. And in fact, it sounds like you're headed a little bit Buddhist, right? Where it's like, once you realize that wanting or dissatisfaction is the root of all suffering, and that's why you work towards detachment in the Buddhist way.
So what you're telling me is I'm just respinning something that's already been thought of.
Well, you're putting a different, well, that's what we all do. Everything's a remix. Everything's a remix.
Yeah. At this point, it's like whenever I have a good idea for like an app, I'm like, oh my gosh, this should be a great app. I just look it up on the App Store. It's already there.
But maybe you could do it differently. Your version would be better.
Yeah. So I did want to get into the ex-Mormon stuff a little bit. You have a very unique perspective, and I haven't met anyone that's done it the way you did it, where you left the church, left ex-Mormon. I mean, you just kind of left everything. Sorry, when I say that, I mean you weren't like involved in the ex-Mormon space. No, and then later on, you came back.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Do you want to talk about that a little bit and just explain maybe why you came back? If it's personal, you don't have to give all, just as much detail as you want.
Yeah. So like when I left, I went into that new atheist group, and I found that very comforting. And that was kind of my new scene for, 20, 25 years. But my family, right? All of my extended family was still, yes, I do have another brother who's not a believer. But, my dad was a bishop, right? And so everybody's still believing. So when I'd go and meet with family, I was a little bit of the black sheep, but I had it fixed in my mind that the Mormon church was kind of like how it was when I left it. There's a 1989 Saturday's Warrior came out during my mission. I'm like, yeah, that's kind of how I remember the church. So if you ever watch the Saturday's Warrior If you haven't watched it, you should. 1989, Saturday's Warrior. It's so great. And you'll see why they made the Book of Mormon musical. It's basically based on Saturday's Warrior, I think. Anyway, so then what happened is in the last 3 years or 4 years ago, I got some news from my mom about things going on with my dad that had a very church flavor to it. I won't go down the rabbit hole, but I realized, hey, I need to be able to, or I need to reacquaint myself with my LDS beliefs in order to talk to my parents more productively about these LDS things that they were discussing. And I was so far removed that in the first discussion I had with my dad, I'm like, we're talking church stuff. And I said something like, yeah, so when President Monson gets up there and he's like, Monson hasn't been the prophet for quite some time. It's President Nelson. Oh. And I was like, oh, like I'm so far removed that he'd been like the prophet for a couple of years or something.
You mean Gorby Hinckley's not the prophet still?
Yeah, I completely lost track of what was going on over there. So I've come back in the last couple of years, and it's been really kind of exciting because I really like Dylan's Mormon Stories podcast, especially when it was a bit older, because man, he had such good interviews with such cool people when it wasn't wasn't cool. But then I feel like it's changed in the last couple of years. So anyway, that's my story. That's why I left, and then I've come back, and now I'm like, oh well, the ex-Mormon community is very vibrant, and people can talk about things that they didn't used to, and it's fun now. Dan Vogel. Dan Vogel's freaking amazing. All his books are like great. I love this stuff.
Yeah. Do you want to comment a little bit on like the difference between when you left as an ex-Mormon versus the ex-Mormon community, or what it's like to be an ex-Mormon now?
Yeah, when I left, I don't know that there really was much of an ex-Mormon community. I'm sure there was, like Sunstone and some people. I don't know exactly what was going on, but I felt like the Mormondom that I left back then was so much tighter, so much more restricted. You couldn't talk about a lot of things back in, the early 90s. That then, thanks in large part to the CES letter and then the gospel topic essays and everything, now I feel like the historicity that used to really bother me back then is all blown wide open now, and they're talking about it everywhere. Now you've got these new scholars at BYU, and you've got guys like Dan McClellan and Patrick Mason who are even interpreting the Book of Mormon as a work of 19th century fiction, I guess. I'm trying to, like, this is a brave new world of Mormonism to me.
It is definitely.
That is kind of fascinating. So yeah, it's very different in how open the church is. Maybe it's because it's been forced to be open. But the other thing I've noticed is that it seems to me that people who leave the church now aren't leaving so much for doctrinal reasons. Now they seem to be leaving because they're outraged, that they're angry, that they don't think the church is following the right policies, and so they're leaving in protest, rather than before when I left, it was purely an intellectual exercise. It was purely like, this doesn't measure up. So I wasn't angry at the church in particular. I was disappointed, but I didn't carry all this like bitterness. And now people seem, at least the ones that I see online, seem disproportionately angry and disproportionately out to tear down the religion that they've left. And that's new to me, I guess. For different reasons. Back then they wanted to tear it down because it wasn't Christian. Now they want to tear it down because it's not Democrat or something.
So I do want to get into that a little bit about, do you view the church as harmful? I know you said you come at this at as an anthropologist, it's just interesting to you in that way. But do you think that the church is doing things that are harmful, or do you think that the church is a harmful organization?
I think there are trade-offs, and it's all the way around. I think there are lots of benefits to the church, especially in terms of community, and in how people kind of have that surrogate family that they can, get part of. You get to know your neighbors. You got people you can rely upon. So I see that kind of hyper tribe benefits that come with Mormonism. Also, that ability to pour everything into a framework so that you can have a direction, motivation. So all these things I think are very important to the well-being of somebody psychologically, and I can see how that works for Mormondom. I think the negatives are in order to prop up the religion, it tears down a lot of empiricism, a lot of epistemology for understanding the world, and makes authority more important than even your own understanding of the world. And so I think it becomes an obedience-based way of viewing things. And I think that part is negative. So trade-offs, right? I'm going to say, oh, there's this and there's that. And I never want to tell somebody that they should leave the church or remain in the church, because everybody's going through their own path, their own journey through life. the same time, I think I want to advocate for a scientific worldview, and that collides with Mormonism in many ways and their authoritarian worldview. And so I disagree with that part. Does that kind of make sense? That I'm like, I can go all over and see pluses and minuses.
I
It's
mean,
hard for me
yeah,
to say it's all good or all bad. Yeah.
no, it totally makes sense. I won't really push out. It would more be net. Do you see a net? But I don't even really want to go there because it's now at this point we're talking like levels of abstraction that get confusing. But I do want to ask about, or I do want to comment that I think it's easy. Obviously, I'm a pretty. You might put me in like I'm in the I'm pretty aggressive against the church, and I have a lot of like pretty um a lot of videos where I'm tearing down the church quite a bit. And I do put myself in the I think the church is harmful category. But that being said, I definitely agree there's a lot of benefits to the church as well. It's more, I think it's false, and there are some additional harms. Therefore, if we teach the truth, or if we try to argue for the truth, then those harms will go away. That's kind of the way I see it. But one of the things that I have a hard time articulating in terms of like harm is the effect it has on your mindset, which is kind of what you're saying, where like it creates people that are very, they have a high respect for authority. And I do think maybe that's the reason that even ex-Mormons, when they leave, they look for an authoritative figure. They're not the empiricists that maybe, a lot of the ex-Mormons in the 90s were, and, like the new atheist movement. They are people that have high respects for authority that leave, then look for a new authoritative figure to follow.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. That a lot of folks when they're leaving, well, they're adrift, right? And so they're looking for a community. And then if they see somebody who's been down that path, hey, we're the ex-Mormons, we've been here, then they feel like, oh, well, I can follow these guys for a while, and it fills that hole, right? And they are already preconditioned to have kind of a community built around authoritative voices. And just kind of drink in the knowledge that's being offered. But I don't want to be, like, I know that a lot of Mormons pass through different stages as they leave the church. Sometimes they get stuck there, it seems like, for a long time. Sometimes they're very, very angry. Like, it's interesting to me to see how different Mormons react differently as they leave. But right now, it seems to me there's an excess of outrage, and it feels to me like the Mormon Stories podcast kind of thrives on that outrage. Like they're always trying to point out the worst that they can so that they can get more clicks and views and be tabloid,
Yeah. And I do think, I also think that the outrage just is a larger problem society wide.
Yes.
I think they kind of just fit, honestly, if you like could graph like the outrage in society, Mormonism or, ex-Mormon outrage is paralleling, the average increase in society's outrage. So I'm not surprised in that regard.
Yeah, if somebody were, considering leaving Mormonism back in the 90s, I think I would have. Well, actually, this did happen. Like with my brother, when I was leaving, he wanted to know, like, what's going on with you, and I said, the question that I think everybody needs to ask themselves regarding Mormonism is, if the church were not true, would you want to know? And anybody who answers that honestly in the affirmative is on their way out. Honestly, I think, because once they ask that difficult question, they're open to the possibility that they could be in error. They become a bit more humble, and I think most of those people leave. But there's many cases where I think people are just perfectly happy in the church. It gives them that framework, and I feel like it's not in the best interest of anyone to go and be a faith destroyer if you don't have some place else for them to land. Like if you don't have a little bit of, okay, I'm going to take down your faith, but I'm going to replace it with some sort of, new worldview that's going to help you transition. Otherwise, I just feel like you might leave them adrift, and then they're vulnerable to being picked up by, something crazy.
But this is where I have a lot of pushback with quite a few ex-Mormons. To me, that sounds a lot like you are being the puppet master, and you are, in fact, that's counter to the whole atheist movement in my mind, which is, I give you the truth, but you're a free thinking agent that then takes that information and chooses your path.
Yeah, that is a very fair criticism, actually. Dan Dennett used to say, I believe in belief, which is kind of what we're doing, where but it's kind of that paternal, like, oh, it's okay for you, but it's not okay for me. And you start realizing that you have a double standard. Totally valid criticism. And I think you're right to point it out that, yeah, the even though I think it's okay for other people to believe, I hope that, that they actually will kind of go the same way I did and become an empiricist when expressed with the evidence. I just don't feel the urge to force or coerce or
Yeah.
push on it, I guess. But I want to share and say, well, let me explain my points of
Well,
view and see what
how
you think.
about
Yeah.
this? What if they say, what if, because I've been going down that route that you expressed, where you actually almost ask them, like I've straight up said, like, I want to say, I want to comment on your religion, and I want to, and I'm going to say something that might hurt your faith. Do you want to hear it?
Yeah.
Which is basically the question you asked. Like, if your faith was not true, would you want to know it? I think if you ask that question beforehand, do you think you need to have a landing pad for them before you answer, or before you express truthful statements that you think will lead them away from the church?
Uh, Not necessarily. Um, yeah, I don't know that you necessarily have a responsibility to say, and I know exactly where I'm going, because then you're trying to evangelize something. Although, to be fair, I realize in my post-Mormon world, I did turn into a bit of an evangelist for like the scientific method and empiricism. That's what makes sense to me. So I guess you do kind of turn into like evangelizing something new. I don't know that you necessarily have to have that just because you're trying to share truth with, a fellow human. And that's perhaps the most important thing you can do is try and, so I'm going to tell you a little story from the amazing meeting real quick that has stuck with me my whole life. So we were at the amazing meeting 2, and there was this small little off group gathering. And there was only about 200 people at this. So I was
Sorry.
sitting there.
Can I pause for 1 second? I
Sure.
actually don't know what that is, and I doubt the audience knows what
Oh,
the
the amazing
amazing
meeting.
meeting. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So the amazing meeting happened in Las Vegas, Nevada for about 10 years. It was called the Amazing Meeting because it was based around the amazing James Randi. James Randi was a magician who debunked a lot of things like, the paranormal, televangelists, psychic surgeries. And so he formed this kind of group that was mostly magicians and skeptics getting together. And it started around just debunking things like homeopathic medicine and these other stuff. But it was kind of atheism adjacent, right? Because that skeptical worldview is very much like that. And so when I attended these amazing meetings, that's what I'm talking about. These meetings in Vegas with magicians and skeptics, and it was actually very libertarian at the time too. That was just had this wonderful viewpoint that I really liked. And in fact, that's what I was getting at, is that we had this meeting. Like Penn Jillette is there, Teller is there. Penn and Teller, because they were very active in this. Jeannie Scott from the National Center of Science Education is there. Basically, all these kind of movers and shakers were getting together. Michael Shermer was there, and we were talking, what are the limits of skepticism? What are we doing here with this, little meeting that we've started up? And some of them were talking, do we talk about religion here? Because they hadn't done that yet. They were just talking about these other things. And in that meeting, Penn Jillette got kind of heated, as he does, and stood up and said, I won't use all the foul language, but he got up and said, if we have any, let me see if I can say it exactly right. If we have any effing moral value in this life, it is to tell the truth as we see it. That he felt that the highest moral principle in life was to tell the truth as you see it at all times. And that stuck with me from Penn Jillette, that your duty as a human might be to not obscure the truth, but to always be sharing the truth as you see it. So Penn Jillette was already in like, hey, if we think their religious beliefs are nuts, we need to call it out, because that's our duty as a human. And I thought that's very interesting way to look at the world. You see the same thing in Sam Harris's book, Lying, right? Never
Yeah.
lie.
So I
Yeah.
haven't read that book, but I generally disagree with the idea of never lying. So
Right.
I'm interested in. I should read the book. I'm interested in how he handles the issue of, like, Nazis are at your door asking if there's any Jews in the house. Do you
No,
lie?
he does, because he's a
I'm assuming.
consequentialist, right?
Oh,
Yeah.
he has to answer that question, just because if you're going to write a book about not lying, you have to have an answer for that question.
Right. No, I think he's nuanced enough to say, well, you lie, in the service of when you have to, like the example you just gave.
Okay.
But lying about your positions and what you believe in order to make somebody else feel better, that sort of thing. Penn Jillette was railing against that. We're not going to soft pedal our viewpoints here. just to make people's fee-fees better, right?
Yeah.
And of course, I'm okay with people's feelings not being hurt, but I think it's really something to think about. Are we morally obligated as humans to try and tell the truth all the time? And once you think that we are, it kind of changes your worldview.
Yeah, there's almost two different tests that I run through. One is there's like the truth test where like I almost ask the person, do you want to know, are you seeking the truth? If so, then to me that opens up the like moral grounds for me sharing truth to you. The other one is if I think there's harm.
Yes.
Like if you're just doing something wrong, like bad that's causing harm, and you're like, I don't want to know the truth. I'm like, I'm gonna tell it to you anyways, because I'm hoping that once you hear the truth, you'll change your actions. And that's where like, yeah, if you watch my channel at all, like the gay rights issue and gay marriage issue is kind of the one area that to me is I'm a little bit more passionate about fighting. And that's where I'm like, that's where I'll start to breach into that. Like, even if you don't want to hear this, I'm going to tell you it anyways, because I think because of your beliefs, you hold these other beliefs that are causing harm.
No, I think that's a good case of like, yeah, there's like, if somebody were joining a cult and you knew it was a dangerous cult, you're gonna have to jump in there and say, hey, this may not work out the way that you think it is, and at least express yourself. You're obligated to do that. Yeah. And I agree with that. Yeah. Sometimes you might have to tell people difficult truths in their own best interests. But then I think you have to, as much as you can, leave the decision up to them, unless they're drugged or something horrible's happened. But that's now we're getting into moral gray areas already.
Yeah. And the cult analogy is great, and I think it's great, although a lot of Mormons don't think it's great. But that is what I use. It's like if someone was in the Branch Davidians, would you say to them, would you feel an obligation? And what if how do I put this? Would you feel like you could share the truth to them even if you didn't have a place for them to go? Like, are you going to be like, this is a cult and you shouldn't follow David Koresh, but here's Mormonism. Like, that's
Right.
how I feel. That's how I feel when people are saying like, hey, if you're going to talk somebody out of Mormonism, give them a religion to go to.
Right.
I'm like, what? That seems so weird. It's like, that's for them to decide. I'm just here to say Waco is the Branch Davidians are a cult.
Right. No, I think that's that's a very good insight. Yeah. That you may, you've got me rethinking about, what are the limits of skepticism and when should you say something and when should you not? I tend to be pretty soft on that sort of stuff because I'll just say, well, in my opinion, it's like this. And then that way I don't feel like I'm attacking them so much as saying, well, here's how I see it. You may see it differently. And it's maybe a softer way of doing it. So I'd feel obliged to at least say how I see things and why it's that way. But I don't feel like it would be productive to like say, but you need to change in order to fit these things, or for my own satisfaction, I guess. That's the libertarian in me really coming out. That I'm like, well, I don't know how to live your life, so
no, I think
ahead.
this is probably where we agree that like I'm gonna give you truth, and I'm hoping that when you hear the truth, that then you'll be like, oh, I can't be Mormon anymore. I'm not trying to tell you not to be Mormon. I'm trying to say, read the CES letter, and then I'm assuming what's going to happen after that.
Right. Yeah, I think if you get too full of yourself, you end up with that kind of you remember when John Dehlin had to apologize to Kwaku about, I don't see how a black person could possibly stay in the church. He said that, and then he had to come out and apologize later.
Yeah.
That's the sort of thing you start to get self-righteous. You start to think that you're above other people and you have, a corner on truth. And then you're in trouble.
Yeah. And honestly, and I sound that way in this conversation, this is like a very theoretical, like, oh, I have the truth, I'm going to give it to you. I never present it that way. And honestly, I don't think of it that way in most cases. But I'm like, here's an argument that to me is compelling. And so I want to give you that compelling argument and see what you do with it. Like the Book of Abraham is like my go-to, but it's like, if you disagree with my argument about the Book of Abraham, which is basically the CES letter argument, then fine, but I want to hear about it. And I also want you to hear my argument because I'm assuming no matter what you think, or I'm assuming it's gonna cause something to at least start to change in your mind once you hear, because it's hard for humans to hear something that is true or at least a good argument and just completely blow it off. I think
Yeah,
to some level it has an effect on you.
yeah, the Book of Abraham, I remember me too, when I was like kind of in that transition, that was kind of my go-to if I wanted hardcore empirical, like here are the claims all laid out nice and clean. Here's all the evidence all nice and
so
clean.
clean. Yeah.
And it just bam, it's like, okay. And it's like this for all the other claims too, but this one is just really easy to see because it's very clear. So yeah, I totally get why that's a good smoking gun to have.
But I totally agree with you that I think atheism in general had, and again, we always talk about it as a group when it's like, always got to remember it's just one claim that we don't believe this. We're not like all the same, but people that tend to identify as atheists, I think do go down they trap themselves a little bit by making claims a little bit more aggressively or strongly than they actually have evidence for. Morality, yes. They do this. I feel like this happens all the time. Even the origins of the universe. I think like one of the most beautiful things about being an atheist is being able to say like, oh, I don't know.
Right.
Like I'm not losing an argument. I don't have to know. And in fact, it's what the evidence indicates. Like the evidence is either non-existent or contradictory. So I'm just going to say, no idea.
Yeah, like it's funny because just recently, right? You've got the James Webb Telescope up there, and there it's looking clear across, and that it's recently discovered galaxies at a time frame or a distance that points so far back in time that it doesn't fit with the model, the Big Bang cosmological model that they've been using on the time frame. And so it's like you'll see all these news articles and stuff, Big Bang theory destroyed, or it's completely blown up, and I'm sitting there thinking it's kind of a scientifically minded thing. I'm like, man, this is so exciting that we've got new data that we're going to have to try and fit into this. It's not like science is now overthrown and we're all, we don't know what we're doing. That's not the case. We've got something new that we're trying to understand. And that's kind of the whole human endeavor of gaining more knowledge about the universe. So I think it's always exciting when we break
when a
something
scientific
wide
model
open.
Is broken.
Yeah.
That is awesome because that's a huge insight that could lead to an even better model.
Exactly. Yes. It doesn't feel bad at all for things to be to recognize you are wrong is to have learned something. And when you recognize daily that you're wrong on so many things, you're learning stuff all the time. It's awesome. It's really kind of exciting.
I have this book here. I don't know if you've ever read it, and I loved it. The Scout Mindset.
I haven't read that one.
It's pretty self-explanatory, but it's basically like we have usually a soldier mindset when it comes to like knowledge. It's very like defensive. Even our language about information is like all this military symbolism, when really we should have this scout mindset, and it should always be like, I'm grateful to learn something new. I'm grateful when I'm wrong because that means now I'm closer to being right on more things.
Yeah, it's hard to do that, but
it's super hard to do that.
But when you do, it's really satisfying when you kind of can start to say, oh, I used to think this, and then I learned these new facts, and now I think this over here, and my new opinion is better supported, and it's more accurate, and it more correctly models reality, and so it's like, why did I ever hold on to that old thing? I just got better from allowing myself to learn new things.
And I've noticed for myself, it's always a little bit of the same emotional reaction at first. And I'm getting better at like identifying when I feel it, which is nice because at first, when I'm hearing information that's contradictory to my existing framework, it hurts. And I'm like, no, bad. Then I'll like think about it. And this might take weeks. And then you start to think about it. And then you're like, okay, what are the implications if this is true? Okay, I actually agree this is true. How is this going to change things? And then after a while, I'm like, wow, like free will is kind of this way where I'm like, I'm starting to more and more almost be forced to accept the idea that we don't have free will. And I don't really like that because it contradicts my, the way I've experienced my life. But to me, I'm like, that's where I've got to go. That's where I have to go at this point because I am dying for someone to present a good argument for where free will can exist. But at this point.
Yeah, well, when we were talking free will earlier, I'll go back to that. If you're going to go down the Sam Harris direction of free will is just anti-determinism, then you'll probably never get an answer there because we live in a deterministic universe as far as we can tell.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're like, well, free will is defined as something different, like Dan Dennett does, that operates within a deterministic universe, then you'll go, oh yeah, I've got sufficient free will enough to make me feel good about living in the world, and that my choices, well, even if they are, all biochemicals, electrons, whatever, it's all happening right here, right? I can't like point to anybody else. So still the responsibility lies with me. And so even if in some degree it's just a user illusion, that's okay. I'll accept it. I'll stare reality in the face and go, it seems like I've got free will, and that's good enough for me.
Yeah. And something I've gotten into quite a bit with, multiple family members at this point, whenever we discuss these things, is have you heard Sean Carroll talk about like different levels of discussion almost? I don't know if that's the best way. That's how he puts it. But like the idea we can talk about a ship, for example, a ship that sails, but we could talk about each plank of wood and there's some analogy that
ship of Theseus.
Yes, the ship of Theseus. Where like, you can talk at the level of the ship, you can talk at the level of the wood, and there's some interaction there that can get confusing, which is the ship of Theseus is if you change out every plank on the ship over time, at what point does it become a different ship?
Right. Yep. Which is the world we live in. Our bodies are always changing. Our brains are always changing.
But
we're not even what we were a week ago.
And so I like the idea of I like to discuss, this reality that we all seem to be experiencing. And to me, that's the definition of reality. It's the thing that we can communicate that we're both experiencing. And that kind of gets rid of, and so like free will, for example, I don't know if we have it or if we don't, but at the level of me and you, it appears that we have it. So we can work with that the same way we can talk about boats. We can talk about cars, even though they're actually just atoms.
Yes. Yeah. It's really about, I see us as primates trying to understand who we are. And so we have such a narrow window into reality, right? Through our senses and that sort of stuff. And it's really quite clumsy, right? We don't really, we weren't designed by the universe to understand the universe accurately. We were just evolved to survive and propagate our genes. So we have this very dim understanding. The fact that we can make any sense of it beyond our basic understanding, turn that into technology, that's amazing, right? That's absolutely incredible. And that gives us more freedom to change both ourselves and to expand upon the world. To me, that is the essence of free will, is this understanding of the universe opens up more opportunities for you to consider where you're going to go, even though it may not be strict free will, the way that anti-determinism, but it's definitely more opportunities, more capacity for action, expanding, evolving freedom, over time.
Yeah. I definitely need, it was Dan Dennett's book on free will that you were talking about.
Yeah.
I need to read more on it in general.
If you want to read Dan Dennett's, so I've got another one here. He recently kicked out a book called From Bacteria to Bach and Back. And what he's done is he's tried to distill his 50 years of a materialist explanation for consciousness and free will into a single book. And so basically he's taken all of his other books and distilled them down, but it's heavy. I mean, he does a lot of, priming and references to his previous books, but I think you could grind your way through it if you're interested.
I actually just, I was just listening to a podcast from
up there.
Cosmic Skeptic, and I forget his name. Goff is his last name, but it was on panpsychism. And so for one, I totally disagree with it, but I felt this whole, I had to run myself through the scout mindset. At first I'm like, this is so dumb. This is so dumb. This is so dumb. I'm like, okay, hold up. Wait a minute. Maybe it's real. And if it is real, I want to know if it's real. So, but he goes all into consciousness and how basically materialism has failed to in any way make a dent in explaining consciousness. So yeah, that book seems right up my alley of interest right now.
Yeah, I'm totally in that Dan Dennett camp of because he believes that consciousness is a completely materialistic phenomenon, right? We don't need to invoke anything.
That's where I am right now as well.
And I don't know. I actually find myself thinking, I don't know how you couldn't arrive at that when you're honest with yourself, because your consciousness is always changing in response to the food you eat and the stuff you drink. If you take a drug or you go to sleep, your consciousness is constantly changing in response to material changes in you. Your experience changes as well. It just says, well, of course your consciousness must be materialistic if you could influence it so much through materialistic means. I mean,
Yeah, I
just
think it
just
was.
makes sense to
I,
me.
I
Yeah.
I was listening to Sam Harris. He was on a panel, and he had said something like, it was basically like you can affect one part of the brain and cause a handicap, and someone can lose their sight, and they can lose their hearing, and they can lose that part of their consciousness. So it's like, that's a pretty big indicator that there's some connection there. Uh,
Right.
and it was Alex in this interview that was actually like the Goff interview. He actually had said like, this seems a lot like a panpsychism of the gaps argument. It's
Yeah.
like, sure, we have the brain and neurons firing, and we have consciousness. I can't say that tonight. And we can't explain how they meet just yet. So someone comes flying in with panpsychism and is like, I have the answer. And it's like, your answer by definition is unfalsifiable because it's outside of science.
Right. It's no longer scientific. It's like saying mind exists independently, and it's some other form of substance or whatever, but you can't verify it. It's unfalsifiable.
Yeah,
You're no
that's like,
longer
okay,
doing
all right,
science.
all right.
Yeah.
My ears are open. Prove it. It's like, well, you can't prove it because it's outside of science. It's
Right.
like, okay, well then why should I believe it? Yeah, and I think that's something that both of. I guess we'll touch on one other topic because you seem to be very like fond of the idea of skepticism, and
Yes. Yeah.
obviously I am as well. But I've heard quite a few ex-Mormons at this point. If you chatted with Marty, it's kind of this idea that like, is skepticism the same as just tearing things down? And is tearing everything down going to just leave you in kind of this nihilistic world where nothing is satisfactory?
Yeah. I think there's a difference between being a skeptic and being a deconstructionist, right? Because there's a lot of this talk about deconstruction that you hear where they try and take something apart into what its components are from a social standpoint, and what they do this for texts and different things. But when you're a skeptic, it's really about developing knowledge. In fact, I think the root of the word skeptic is skepsis, which I think might actually be knowledge or something. But it's about interrogating the universe in order to understand it better, right? That's what I think skepticism really is. It's not about just tearing everything down. It's with intent to understand, to find out what the underpinnings are, what makes everything tick. And so when you're skeptical, you're like, huh, how does that work? I'm skeptical. I want to understand the pieces and components, not just to destroy it, but to see. And then as through that process, you begin to say, oh, well, that doesn't fit that well. Quite often, this televangelist, I'm skeptical of how he operates. So he's really got a radio bud in his ear that he's, getting stuff. That's what James Randi revealed, right? That's how he
Oh,
caught
nice.
Peter Popoff, was that he was getting these messages in his ear and
Oh,
pretending to
wow.
have witnesses from God. But that's what a skeptic does, right? They go and find out. It's an empiric approach. Michael Shermer is, I got to give him a lot of credit. He's been publishing Skeptic magazine, and he's been through this whole thing way back from New Atheism all the way to the modern day, through all the woke movements and stuff. And he's still just plugging along, being a good old skeptic guy, putting out his magazine. And he's been pretty consistent.
Oh, really
He
nice.
hasn't, yeah, he hasn't
I
hasn't
so I
gotten
haven't
lost
read
in
any of
anything.
Skeptic magazine, but if that's the case, then I give him a lot of credit as well because there's a lot of like, I feel like it's rare to see people that are that consistent.
Yeah, I think so too. Like, I think a lot of the other folks who were in the atheism movement just got swept up into kind of that neo-Marxism
And
stuff.
I think we all are dying to know where Christopher Hitchens would stand nowadays with wokeism.
Well, I think he'd be very opposed to it. When we were at the amazing meeting, he got booed. He got up and he was talking in his kind of a neoconservative. We need to. At that time, the Iraq War was going on, and he
Yeah,
was in
that's it.
favor of it. Right?
That's
Yeah, he was.
his. I feel like that's his not biggest blunder, but he got the most crap for that position.
Yes. And that was yeah, I was there. People booed him at the amazing meeting while he was up there speaking, and then afterwards I actually went and had drinks with him. You know, I sat down and had a drink, and I thought he was just a
Gosh.
miserable person. You know, he did not seem happy. He seemed very sad at the time.
No,
He
you're
was
you're
just,
ruining my fantasy.
yeah. But it was just that one moment, right? You
Yeah, he was
know,
having a bad day.
he was
We
having
all
a
have
bad
bad
day,
days.
but I was like, he just got booed on stage. He he
Yeah.
didn't seem very happy. Yeah.
Yeah, just doubling back to I think a lot of people will conflate skepticism with tearing down. But I think, for example, what you could do with a skeptic mindset is you could or, find out there's flaws in things and then analyze it and say, with all the flaws, I still think some people think that like skepticism means that you're only going to be a part of a group if it's perfect, for example. And it's like, no, you could say like, I'm skeptical. And I found out that, they'll say that about like, if you're a skeptic, look at all the things that America's done wrong in its history. And it's like, yeah, I agree that like, first of all, I agree that a skeptic should look at the flaws in America. And then it's still perfectly plausible that you can say, yeah, we're not a perfect system. The United States has made a lot of mistakes, but I think we're going in the right direction or we're striving to. So, despite the problems, I can still be a part of this group. So, I think it's almost like a logical fallacy to assume that if you're skeptical, you're going to find flaws in everything. So, you'll never be able to be a part of a group. And I just think that's
Yeah.
not the case.
Yeah, I don't think it's the case either. To me, skepticism is a lot about bringing the scientific method to bear on other questions, right? On all aspects of life. But you do believe in the scientific method, and you do believe in the empiricism, and that you do believe that it will give you better results in the end. So there's your belief, right? That you're like, we're approaching truth through this methodology of interrogating the universe, empirically and through testing and a
Gosh,
scientific
yeah.
approach.
And
And
then what you
so
do with
hopefully you're
that
getting
truth.
better. Yeah. Yeah. If there's like one book that I think everybody should read as they come out, it would be Carl Sagan's The Demon Haunted World. That was the last book he wrote right before he died, and it's all about science as a candle in the dark. And he actually kind of predicts our day, where he says, I have a foreboding that in the future we're going to live in a technological society where people aren't going to understand their technology, and they're going to get lost in these, groups, and they'll have lost their ability to tell truth from error. And so that's what that whole book is about, is saying it's a defense, a robust defense of science and skepticism as a way to understand the world and not see it as the demon haunted world that our ancestors used to see it as. Right. So anyway, that's,
Yeah, very
there's my
cool.
plug on a book for skepticism and science.
I'm gonna read it,
Yeah,
honestly. I appreciate
really
it.
good. Yeah, I think you'll love it. It's very easy reading, one of Carl Sagan's best books.
Cool. Let's see if I have any other questions here that we should hit before we call it a night. Anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to bring up?
Well, I do like to ask that one question of somebody who's been out of the church a little while, like Joseph Smith. Do you think Joseph Smith believed in himself? Did Joseph Smith believe in Joseph Smith Jr.?
I feel like this might be a cop-out answer, but I think early on, no. And then I think later on, yes. And I think
So
that's probably
you
the
think he
case.
started out as kind of a like playing a long con or something, and then
Yeah, like mostly like the treasure hunting stuff. I just can't believe that he actually believed he had the ability. Um, so to me, that tells me that he is okay with lying to people, but I think it could be a totally, a very powerful thing to be a liar early on, and then you have a massive movement following you, and then you can be like, oh my gosh, maybe I am supposed to be here, like,
right, yeah,
because I like the depending on where you're asking the question, I think by the end of his life he believed.
yeah. I think so too. I have the same. Dan Vogel refers to Joseph Smith as a pious fraud, right? That
Mhm.
he believed what he was doing was right, but he was also aware at times he was kind of helping it along by being fraudulent and putting stuff together. And I think that's the best explanation that I've seen for the Joseph Smith phenomenon, because there are times when I think Joseph Smith had to believe at a deep level, both to rebuke himself, right, and also some of the stuff that he put in there. Otherwise, he wouldn't have carried through. It's my opinion that Joseph Smith maybe did have some of those early visions, But I don't think he actually saw God the Father and Jesus, but I think he may have had like a seizure or epilepsy, like a temporal lobe sort of thing, when he was out there praying a few times, and then that made him think, I have a calling in life. I just don't know exactly what it is. And it started him on that whole path of, well, whatever brings you to believe in Christ is a good thing. I can help bring people to Christ through these methods, right? I kind of think he felt like he had a divine calling from quite young. He just wasn't quite sure what it was and was discovering it as he went along. But that's that's my feeling on Joseph Smith Jr. But by not seeing him as just this contemptible con man, it also gives me a little bit of empathy for what he must have went through as he went through life. And at times it makes things that happen make more sense to me, that he was like, oh, he did this because he really believed in it, not because it was.
Yeah, I totally think it's hard to explain a lot of what he went through if he didn't believe it.
Yes, yeah.
But to me, it doesn't
make it right. Yeah,
it doesn't give you much because there's a lot of bad people that have believed in themselves. So it's like, I think he probably falls into that category. It's like, yeah, he totally believed it for whatever reason. I have no idea what the reason is, but by the end of his life, I would put my money that he did believe.
Yeah.
And
think
kind
so
of what
too.
you're saying, to what extent too, there's like some variation there. Did he, and I guess almost like, what are we saying he believed? Did he believe that he was called of God? I would say, yeah, he probably did. But did he believe that he spoke to God through the first vision? That may, like you're kind of indicating, that may have been a lie, but in the service of his true belief that he actually believed he was a tool in God's hand.
Right. Yeah, I think he may have had some experiences when he was young that then he reinterpreted later as like, oh, well, that vision I had when I was 14 was really God calling me to the, to prophecy. I see it as more of a retroactive application as he started to discover his prophetic calling, and then convinced himself, I think pretty early on, that he was somebody special, doing something special for God to bring people into Christ. And so then he, most of what I think Joseph Smith did, he did with good intent, but he also knew he was very flawed. And I think all his stuff with polygamy and all the rest of that was him wrestling with his own demons. I don't think he wanted to be that guy, but he was that guy. I don't know. That's kind of how I I take it.
I get it.
Yeah.
I've been listening to quite a bit of Bart Ehrman lately, and I'd almost respond the way that he respond, which with a lot of the apostles, he would say that they believed that they had a vision, or they believed that they had an experience. And I think that's kind of what you're saying. It's like, I don't know what vision he had, but he thought he had a vision, whether that was epilepsy or some hallucination of some sort. He was convinced of something.
Yeah, I find that hypothesis really kind of fascinating, because when you study like epilepsy, like I think Julius Caesar was said to have epilepsy, like Fyodor Dostoevsky had epilepsy, right? And these guys had great insights and stuff. And there's actually a syndrome called Gershwin syndrome, I think, or Geschwin syndrome, that they know that people who have had temporal lobe epilepsy seizures will often be much more religious. They'll often have changes in their sexual behavior. They'll often see things in terms of circumstantiality, where they see everything is connected, right? They have all these like syndromes that happen as a result of these changes in their brain. And when I look at those and I look at the Joseph Smith story, I'm like, maybe there's something happened there where he did have some visions when he was young, and it kind of impacted his brain, which then raises the deeper question, like for Midnight Mormons or something. Well, if I came upon Joseph Smith and he's over there in the Sacred Grove having that first vision, what would it look like? Would I actually see God the Father, or would I just see Joseph Smith bent over, like having a vision, and it's all happening inside his head? And to me, that's like, if it's the latter, then maybe temporal lobe epilepsy is how God communicates with prophets. Zap,
Exactly.
I don't know. I'm just speculating, but that's the sort of fun stuff that I think helps to make the whole process interesting.
And it seems like that's where you're saying a little bit that you're pretty far removed at this point, where you can look at it from more of a anthropological lens, and just, what is, because I agree that it's fascinating regardless of where you stand. The history of Joseph Smith and what he accomplished is fascinating. And so it's interesting, like, what motivated this guy?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of good questions to be asked, even from an ex-Mormon.
Yeah, just coming back and having the church be so open about its past and that you can talk about things is amazing, because church is the richest church on the planet and the richest church that there's ever been, right? It's like crazy, and that all started from this Joseph Smith guy, and there's just kind of like, well, how did that go down?
Yeah.
I kind of want to know the story, and it's a more fascinating story than is even imaginable. Whether you're pro or con, it's just a
Yeah.
cool story.
I'm assuming, have you seen Stephen Pinecker and Jeff McCullough of Hello Saints? Have you seen those guys?
I haven't seen them talking. I follow some of Steve Pinecker stuff though.
Yeah, but both not Mormons, and they're both just like, what is the, like, how did this happen? This is crazy. They're just fascinated with Mormonism.
It is. It's such a fascinating religion. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it totally is. All right. Well, unless you've got any other final thoughts, any other things you want to talk about?
No, thanks for getting me on your show, just to kind of have this rambling discussion about a bunch of crazy Mormon thoughts. But I think it's really fun to be reaching out to one another like this, and having kind of this I don't know, skeptical sort of approach to Mormonism that isn't really rooted in some sort of politics. It's just, we just want to know what the truth is, and we just want to understand things.
Yeah, and I feel like I'm talking like you're like older, wiser. You've been around this, because I'm similar to you in a lot of ways, I think. But one of them is that when I first left, it was like atheism, the new atheist movement, was kind of like my guiding light. Those are the guys I was reading. I was like, this is amazing. And then after a few years, I swerved over back into the ex-Mormon space, largely because of family issues, like you were saying, and because my brother Jacob was getting involved in YouTube.
Right. Yeah.
So my heart really lies with the new atheist movement more than ex-Mormonism. And now I feel like a lot of us are kind of getting attracted back to this thing. But it's been interesting to hear your perspective, having spent a lot of time not in ex-Mormonism and then seeing it the way it is now.
Yeah, coming back to Mormonism at the end, I think the LDS Church has changed tremendously in these 30 years. Like, it's almost a different church now. It's so much more open, and to me, it's moved in the right direction. Like, it seems like it's in many ways a better, more open church. So, who knows where it's going to be in another 10 or 15 years, right? So, I don't know.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. That's all I've got. I'm Forrest Latter-day Skeptic, and thank you for watching.